Oh, for some reason, Heather, I thought we assumed, I thought maybe I just
Oh,
assumed you were going first. I don't know. Do you want to
I
go first? I'm happy to go first too.
it doesn't matter to me. I'm trying to remember. So Jake, were you in my metaphysics class last semester? No. Okay. So the productivity stuff then will be new for you too. So I'll just start with that. So I put this document in the chat. Hopefully you all can see that. And yeah, one of my kind of side hobbies is reading a bunch of pop psychology. So that's the results of Heather's hobby there. I've summarized a ton of that literature. And so I find a lot of it really helpful. So what I'm going to do is go through that. And I think probably the best thing, maybe I'll share my screen. Should I do that? And then you guys I'll walk you through it. So let me make sure I get the right one. Okay, so feel free to throw questions in the chat as I go or raise your hand, and I'm happy to pause and talk about stuff more. I'll go fairly quickly so that we have time for discussion and questions, because I know a lot of this will be specific to you. So the first thing I want to begin with is just by saying the most important thing about any writing habit is that you write. So like the most important thing is that you actually write. Now, for me, people differ in how often they like to write in chunks. For me, to get a paper from like first starting a draft to something I might think about submitting to a conference, say, probably not quite ready for a journal, but close. It's about 2 months, assuming that I write every day for 1 to 2 hours. And so that's kind of like the time frame for me of like how long I need to put in. I like to do it regularly because it's a habit, and then I don't forget and I don't get tired of my work or forget about it. So for me, it's regular, the same amount every day, the same time every day. A lot of people who don't think that will work for them, it ends up working for them. So if you haven't tried that in a serious way, I encourage you to. Other people for sure have different ways of doing it. Like maybe you have, good longer afternoon where you really can focus for 3 or 4 hours at a stretch. In which case, you wouldn't necessarily need to do it every day. But here's just some like general productivity advice. So, this stuff is you find in almost every productivity book. They'll recommend something like this. So if something takes fewer than 1 to 5 minutes, you should do it immediately. If you need to download a paper or whatever for a project, just do it rather than writing it on a to-do list. 80-20 rule. So that's the 80% of the value comes from 20% of the activity. The upshot for philosophers, especially who control their own time, is that you can actually waste a ton of time by kind of perfecting little things that don't need to be perfected. So keep that in mind. Large projects in general can feel overwhelming. So rather than thinking, oh, I need to write that paper, don't ever say that to yourself, right? Because that's really overwhelming, the idea I have to write a paper. So try and break it up. Try and say like, what's literally the very first task that I need to do before I can write this paper? And often there will be something very specific that is very doable. So maybe it's like, read this paper. Like, you have to read that paper before you start writing your own paper. So do that, right? Put that at the top of your list. And often, even as you're writing, the next step is also super specific. So it's like, I need to get feedback on this. So then spend a few minutes brainstorming. Who should I send it to? Who haven't I sent a draft to in a while that might offer me feedback? Stuff like that. Who would be well positioned to give me feedback? And then just do it. Just send the draft. Oftentimes, if you're like hesitant to write, this can be rooted in your emotions, and it can be worthwhile to notice when you have other thoughts, like you go to write and you find yourself thinking like, I hate philosophy, I'm going to quit, this is stupid, what was that author thinking anyway? Because often those are like signs of emotional defensiveness, and it can be worth like sorting through that as like a separate project, because probably it's not that you're actually bad at philosophy or bad at writing, it's that you have this kind of emotional hang up. So cognitive behavioral therapy is kind of the most popular evidence-based therapy for issues like that. And cognitive distortions, things like, I always write crappy term papers, those are really common, right? Lots and lots of people have them, and they're very treatable. So good news. And you can do your own kind of research on that. Now, Other great advice: batch your emails so you're not going through your email when you should be writing. That means doing them all at once so you can be much more efficient. Having a task management system, a lot of people find very useful. I like getting things done, this GTD. There's more on that in the handout, although I probably won't go through that too much today. Turn off your phone, right? Get your work email off your phone, set snooze, do something. Block the web, right? So when I sit down to write, if my email is accessible, like if I could click on a link to get to my email, I would do that. And I know that because I'm like very distractible. So what I do is use this software or this add-on called Leechblock. And I put a list of all the things that like the better me knows I shouldn't be accessing. So things like Reddit, Craigslist, email, the New York Times, all those I would very happily be on instead of doing my work. So those are leech blocked from, and for me, my most productive time is in the morning. So I have prioritized having my work in the morning. So from 7 to 8:30, the kids know like this is mom's work time. I don't get bothered, they just have to be on their screens. And that's when everything's leech blocked. So I literally cannot answer my email during that window, and that's amazing. It makes it so much easier to focus because even if I'm on my document typing, if I know the email's there in the background, it's super distracting. I'm like constantly thinking, should I check it? No, don't check it. This is writing time. But once it's removed as like an option, it goes away. So this has been probably the best thing for me is leech block, being able to block these other apps. Now, the other thing is being really intentional about your time. So thinking to yourself, what are my biggest priorities today? And this goes for anything. So if it's writing, that might be on there. If it's like getting a half hour of exercise, that's on there. And then what you do is you figure out what time you're going to set aside in order to do those things. And if you have like 100 things on your list in one day, well, that's not going to work, right? Time doesn't magically appear. So what you need to do is prioritize. And then once you've done that, you've decided what's really important and you're doing it, then you get to wholeheartedly like endorse that decision. So there should be no background worry about like, oh, should I be doing this? Because you can tell yourself, I've decided, right? I like thought about this and I decided this was important and now I'm doing it. So it's like this kind of guilt-free, and it works for anything. If you've decided it's really important to have like a lunch where you're like fully present, you're like enjoying all the foods or whatever, then you get to fully do that, right? So this is another thing that's really helpful. The other thing that I want to mention is having a system for taking notes. So for me, I use something called The Brain. Rome Research is also popular. They're both ones you have to pay for, which is annoying. But it doesn't matter what your system is. I'd be happy to show you The Brain in the Q&A if you're curious. But the point of taking notes is to turn a paper that you've read into something that you can digest and state in your own terms, right? So once it's in your words, you have owned it, and now you know what that paper's about. And often it's really helpful in the note-taking process to write critiques. So Jake, you'll probably remember this. I think you were in one of my metaphysics classes. At any rate, you get to do like the article summaries, and those are really how you should be taking notes. You'd say, what's the most important? What are my objections, concerns? How would I respond or react to this paper? Because what philosophy writing is responding, right? You're engaging with the literature. And so if you get in the habit of doing that every single paper you read and you take notes on it, then it becomes a very fruitful, fruitful kind of background to getting a lot of writing that you'll like. Now I'm going to just mention a few other things in terms of general productivity. So if you're curious about these, you can read a lot more. One strategy that's really helpful is to embrace a growth mindset. This is particularly good when you get rejections from journals. So I got one today and immediately had to go for like a 30-minute run. So angry. But, then and I think it's important to like experience that, sadness or despair. You like experience that and then you move on, right? And then you say, okay, I'm going to go through these comments. I'm going to make this paper better and I'll send it out again. So part of having a growth mindset is when you get criticism, you say, fantastic, I have so much that I can grow, right? So much to learn. And indeed, even when I get a rejection, I'm so much happier when it comes with comments and feedback, because I think, wonderful, this is actionable. I can like read through the comments and then improve the paper. So particularly if you're getting feedback from other professors or from peers, it's wonderful, right? Even if it feels like criticism, you need to get to a place where you can interpret that as wonderful. It's so helpful. Thank you, right? This will make it better. This is an ongoing process, and some people are better at it than others. So one of the things about setting aside regular writing time, I don't know if you guys do this already, but I think the best way to do it is, rather than thinking of it as a willpower thing, like I just need to like be really disciplined, you make it a habit, right? And you design your environment so that the habit becomes second nature. And so if you're curious about how to develop habits, I think this book, Atomic Habits, is great. There's also one called Tiny Habits, kind of the same book. So either one describes a really kind of like research-based way of developing a habit. I think the most important thing for me was this where and when, right? So like when I say I should do this, I'm no longer allowed to say that, right? I should write a paper. I can't say that because there's no like slot into where it's going to fit. I have to say, if I want to do this, I need to set aside the time, because just saying I have to do this or I should do this or, oh, I haven't done that yet, doesn't actually make it happen. Okay. The other thing that I think is easy to discount is how important deep work is particularly salient for me with kids. So if I'm watching the kids, I cannot do any deep work, right? I can't write anything good. That's because they're so distracting, right? So you need to figure out a way for you to get this like deep focused work, and that means distraction free. There's other stuff you can do when you're super distracted. Answering email is a great example. But some things you really do need your full focused attention. Okay, getting things done. There's a comment, what did you say, Daniel? My favorite productivity system I don't use. So fair enough. I use it. I really like it. You're welcome to read more, ask me questions about that if you like. You should be really brutal about your priorities. So if there are things you should think, should I be doing this, right? And that ultimately, so that I like this, ask, should I be doing this at all, right? So there's nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. That I really have this problem, right? Things that seem, oh, I should do that. Even if I do them super efficiently, if it's the kind of thing I really shouldn't have done in the first place, because it's not as good use of my time as other things, then it's still kind of a failure. And so rather than thinking I should be more and more efficient so I can do all the things, you need to take a critical look at the things and then say which ones of these are actually important. So there's some other fun stuff. John Perry's written this fun little book on the art of procrastination. Structured procrastination is letting yourself do something that's like second best because you just can't get yourself to do the first best. And then at the end, you will have done the second most important thing. So that can be useful. Good to have an accountability partner, right? Someone who will trade drafts with you, and that I find really, really valuable, particularly once you're no longer a graduate student. So it's kind of future advice, although it's current advice too. You absolutely should be reading each other's work and giving each other helpful feedback. But also, once you no longer have professors who are kind of like contractually obligated to give you feedback, you need people to do it because you're doing a trade or they're nice or whatever. So find people like that, people who give you helpful, useful feedback, and then do this kind of trade, right, where you trade drafts. And sometimes that can be really helpful, right? So you have a certain day or time when you're going to do the trade. The final thing here is, if you do have something unpleasant, sometimes people can get into the mindset where they just do that thing the first, right? That's the first thing that they do. They just eat the frog, get it over with. I'm not very good at that, but I know some other people are. Okay, so that was the kind of like productivity. So like, how do you actually write? Because again, as I said, writing itself is the most important thing. So if you struggle to write, hopefully the productivity stuff will help. And then I have other things that I'm happy to answer questions about the process itself, like the stuff that Alex helpfully put in the Word doc. But because I have this side interest, I figured I'd focus on that for now. All right, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah. By the way, so Heather and I used to be in a writing group together, and I suspect we will again be in the writing group in the future. This has been the last year's been a little bit tough for that kind of stuff. But so I knew going into this that Heather was going to nail down the productivity stuff. So I chose not to talk about sort of my productivity strategies. But I really want to emphasize like two things, especially the take notes on everything you read. And take critical notes on everything you read. First of all, you just should be doing that. That's just like, you can't really read like a philosopher if you're not taking critical notes, if you're not critically engaged. But yeah, keeping them on your computer someplace. I label them. I don't have them very well organized, but I could find them. That's super helpful. Like that saves so much effort in the long run. And also scheduling your time and like knowing what you're supposed to do and like not feeling guilty about doing what you're supposed to do. But also, I think, Heather, I don't think you quite mentioned this, but not feeling guilty about being done with what you're supposed to do and then not doing anything. So useful. Like I've been, especially during the pandemic when you're at home and you could always be working. I started writing down on my calendar everything I've achieved and like labeling it with a certain color. And I can look say, oh, I did enough today. I don't need to do anything else. I can relax. I can play drums or whatever, play video games or whatever. Like, and then not feeling bad about that. Because part of how you make yourself unproductive, I think, is by expecting yourself to be superhuman and not rewarding yourself for being good. Anyway, I made a little PowerPoint, not because I actually think it's a good idea, but because it was a good way for me to take notes for myself. So let me just satisfy us a little bit here. Let's see. Slideshow, from current slide. Okay. You should be seeing the slideshow right now. Unmute yourself if you're not. Okay, part of my writing process. So I'm going to talk about my personal writing process. Where do I get ideas? I think people often worry about this a lot. A lot of my recent ideas have been taking two things I already knew about and then squishing them together. And then it doesn't always work, but when it works, it's really nice. So like these are three relatively recent papers, and like this paper, I was like, hey, there's a conference coming up I'd really like to go to. It's in formal epistemology. I've been thinking about this stuff in ethics. I wonder if there's like a parallel, because if there is, no one's ever pointed it out. And then like looking around for parallels and it's like, oh, there is a parallel. And that paper came out of it. Or like, I went to a talk where they're talking about AI ethics. And I'm like, oh, this kind of reminds me of some stuff I've been thinking about moral uncertainty. I wonder if you can squish them together. And then I ended up co-authoring a paper with the people giving the talk. And then a lot of my work has come from my teaching. And this is like, because personally, I really like to teach open questions because I think that gets students more excited, where they're kind of able to sort of see themselves as doing some philosophy rather than reading about philosophy someone else has already finished doing. And then I also like to think a lot when I teach about, and I suspect that everybody's like this, but what motivates the people who are arguing, the people who are reading and talking about. And then the better you understand their motivations, you start to see things where you're like, oh, wait a second. So like here's this paper right here, the truth promoting paper. I was teaching some stuff on epistemic value, and I started thinking, there's these weird little bits in every paper we're reading, and I don't quite get why they're there. And I started thinking about the motivation. I'm like, oh, there's this like whole background discussion that people are not making putting in the foreground, that's like behind all of these papers we're reading that no one's talking about, and then paper ended up coming out of that. So, and then to a lesser degree, this is actually mostly my early papers, and this isn't every paper I've ever written, but my early work was more like I was reading stuff as part of my research and like responding to it. But I think that's actually not, for me, not as fruitful as like teaching stuff that I ended up writing about, or just kind of like taking ideas and putting them together. So when I talk to people, they often worry about how they're going to get ideas. I think this is probably the thing you shouldn't be worrying about. And if you need some tips, teach stuff that's interesting is probably the best tip I can give you. I just talked about that. So I write all my ideas down and I keep them for future consideration. So here's a screenshot over on the side of my miscellaneous paper folder. And this is, you can see 110 items. This is over many, many years, by the way. Most of the stuff is not going to go anywhere. It's not going to do anything. But I write all of these ideas down. And then I get them, then they're like out of my head and I don't have to stress about them anymore. And it's very soothing. And then also if I want later on to look at the idea or I want to look up some ideas, it's all in one place. When I write my ideas down, what I'm trying to do is just like explain the idea to my future self and to say a little bit about why it might be interesting. It's really kind of just thinking through the idea on paper. And I note, oh, I'm like, oh, here's a question that might come up. Oh, here's a, maybe not a great idea for these reasons. I kind of just note that stuff. If I don't, I'm like, I'm not sure what this would mean, or is this kind of what I'm trying to say here? I just flag that. This is very casual. It's like just kind of trying to talk it through and get it out of my head so then I can stop thinking about it and do something else. And I make notes about objections. And this is just so I have something I can look at later on, where if I need to look at that idea. Most of these don't go any further than getting stuck in a file in that big old folder on my hard drive. So, not every idea is going to get developed. So a lot of times when I write an idea down, as I've written it down, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, this is actually a bad idea. I have lots of bad ideas I should mention, but I write all of them down because I notice the same bad idea will come back to me over and over and over again. And so if I've written it down, I can go remind myself why it was a bad idea. So here's some comments from like the last few ideas I had. So after like 3 or 4 like paragraph level notes, I'm like, oh, actually, maybe this is not that interesting. These are direct quotes. Or I'm like, oh, here's how this would go. Is that surprising? Maybe this is, you don't have to worry about the details. I'm like, oh yeah, maybe it just makes you say X and who cares? Or, oh yeah, I guess there's a problem in these really weird cases, but who cares, right? So a lot of the stuff I'm like, oh yeah, it's just not that interesting, but I needed to write it down to kind of, to get it out of my head and to know it wasn't interesting. And then again, a lot of times these ideas will reoccur to me, I've noticed. And then I'm like, oh yeah, why did I think that wasn't interesting before? Or what did I think about that before? Super helpful. So basically, it's not worth putting time into something where I'm like, even if I could prove this conclusively, no one else would care. Then I'm like, okay, I'm done with that idea. Sometimes it's not so obvious if you should develop an idea further, at least in my experience. And so I think about, do I know this literature? Or am I gonna have to do a ton of work to be able to even start developing this further, right? How much work is gonna have to go into figuring this out? How much work is gonna go into making these arguments work? If I could make this point conclusively, would that be something that would be interesting to people? If I can't make it conclusively, but I can make a case for it, or I can get part way, could that be interesting? This is, I think, a thing that people often neglect early in their career. There are things you can put work into where you're like, no matter how this pans out, it's gonna be worth writing down. There's stuff where you're like, if I can prove X, that's exciting. But if I can't prove X, that's also exciting. And those are really nice ideas to pursue. And then how interested am I personally in this? Even if it would be revolutionary to philosophy, which I've never had an idea that would be revolutionary to philosophy, hypothetically. Even if it would revolutionize philosophy, if I don't want to put the work into, I'm not going to put the work into it. And so I'm trying to pick a combination of how much work, how worthwhile is that work, and then will I be able to make myself do it? And that's how I choose what to put the work into. So just kind of looking at a bunch of ideas I've written down the last 2 years that weren't an idea that was directly relevant to a paper I was working on at the time. A bunch of them turned out just to be bad ideas. And I realized that after I thought about them as a course of writing them down. And then some of them looked like they were interesting. And then I'm like, oh, this might be worth pursuing. And then I maybe read a little bit. I'm like, oh yeah, this is not interesting or new. I just need to do some casual reading to realize that. And then I realized, and then others I'm like, oh, this could be interesting, but I don't know. And the amount of effort it would take to figure out if it was worth pursuing was just clearly not worth it given the other things on my plate. This goes back to what Heather was saying. You know, you don't want to be putting your time into things that aren't worth your time. You don't have enough time. And so this is sort of my calculus. Is this worth my time? And then I end up sticking a couple into other papers that they ended up being kind of connected to. And then a couple where I'm like, oh, this is a kind of a cool idea. I wonder if this is worth it. I'm kind of excited about it, but they're definitely too ambitious right now. But I'll come back to them later on. And then the two of them, I ended up starting papers, and one of the papers is finally finished. But of a bunch of like random stuff that I wrote down, most of it didn't go anywhere. But I'm glad I wrote it down, and maybe some of it will go someplace down the road. And then often what will happen is like years from now, I'll be like, oh, hey, this is vaguely connected to this other thing. Let me just go look up my thoughts on that. And then it'll end up being a little productive down the road. I find that people, I'm gonna actually stop screen sharing in a second because I wanna show you my pile of notes. People often wanna jump into like writing a paper, like opening up a Word document and then starting with their introduction or whatever, right? People wanna jump right into that, I find. And I think that's, for me, often a mistake. When I'm like in the headspace where like I'm writing this paper now, I start thinking about organization, I think about framing, I'm thinking about how am I gonna say this exactly right? And that's all distracting me from thinking about the philosophy, right? So when I'm writing a paper, I'm not thinking about the philosophy as much, I'm thinking about the paper side, and that's splitting my attention, it makes me way slower. And also, for me, writing a paper seems really high stakes. And I'm not as willing to kind of like play around with my ideas where I need to do, which I really need to do early in the process. And then often when something's in a paper, I really have a hard time cutting it. Whereas if it's just like a random thought I had, it's easy to cut. So I do a ton of note taking before I start writing. And Julia said I should show this to you. This is some of my notebooks for the last few years, and they're just all handwritten notes. Most of this is gibberish. It's mostly, by the way, some of these like, just all these handwritten notes to myself. And it's just like my process for thinking things through. And the idea is the note-taking stage is like 0 stakes. I'm not accountable. No one's ever gonna see those. No, I didn't even let you read those. You see that they exist, but like, they can be embarrassing and stupid and whatever, and I don't care. I just don't worry about it. I just thinking through, but I find it easier if I write it down to think better for whatever. So this is again, just my process. And I'm gonna embarrass myself a tiny bit. So I actually took some pictures on my phone of some of my pages. This is from a thing I'm working on. And I just want to kind of notice, like, I want you to kind of, I think blah, blah, blah. Don't worry about what I'm talking about. Then here's a little thing, notice this in brackets where I'm like, oh, wait a second. Why does that matter? Oh, here's why it matters, right? So I'm like stopping myself and saying, why am I talking about this, right? And over here, notice, is this really, I have this analogy I'm using, like, is this really a good analogy? And then I was like, and like, again, I'm just like talking to myself. And then I'm like, norms like that suck. Right? I would not put that into a paper. I've wanted to many times, but I'm just like, I'm not going to worry about how to express this idea perfectly well. I just want to get some thoughts down in the paper, and then I can go back and fix it up later on. And then I'm like, oh, here's what someone might say. No, blah, 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 blah. Right? And again, I'm like, almost like I'm talking to myself. And then I notice, I'm like, oh, wait a second. I'm actually totally equivocating two things that I shouldn't be, but I didn't notice that until I had this whole long conversation with myself. And again, making it totally 0 stakes, I actually learned a lot from this process. Almost none of the previous 4 pages made it into the paper, but I needed to do that to figure out the stuff that did make it into the paper. And like doing it in this kind of 0 stakes, I'm just like chatting with myself kind of thing, I couldn't do it any other way. So again, this is my own personal process. When I'm doing notes taking, I'm focusing on just tiny parts of the paper. This is also, Heather said, you don't sit down to write a paper. That's frightening. It's unmanageable. But I can sit down to write this section or figure out this argument or figure out this objection. I do it like talking to myself. I actually do talk to myself quite a bit. I find that people are much better verbal thinkers than they are written thinkers. And so writing it down just a way of kind of talking it through, but then in a permanent way that I can look back to. I don't worry about making mistakes or being uncertain because I'm going to make mistakes and I'm going to be uncertain. I'm going to be unclear. And if I worry about that stuff now, I will never get anything done. My first initial stuff is just not good. It never has been good. I've never had just a good idea. Well, maybe I hope so. Hopefully I have. It's okay, Brian. But I almost never just have good ideas. But I have a thing that I can then, I use the metaphor of playing with it. I just play with the ideas long enough in the arguments and something comes out of it sometimes. But I find that people often would want to have, they want to go from, you know, I was walking down the street, something came to me and it was a work of genius and I wrote it down and now I have a good paper. And I'm like, well, great. Good for you, Einstein, or whatever. I doubt even Einstein did that. I don't know how you expect that to happen unless God speaks directly to you, in which case, write that down. But for me, I have some kind of ridiculous idea that's kind of incoherent and half-cocked, and I write it down and I mess around with it, and most of the time it goes nowhere. But then sometimes it'll go someplace. But I had to go through that process. And if I expect a lot of myself early on, I just won't do anything. And I've noticed this in people I know who have struggled with productivity, is that they start writing way too early. And they're trying to be good early. And where I'm like, I'm just gonna write down some words and they're mostly gonna be not the right words. And then I will fix them later on. Then I go to the outline stage, I re-outline a lot. I will go to papers I've already written and then I'll re-outline them again by hand, and then I'll reorganize them. It's so helpful. And then I start writing. When I'm writing my first draft, I use placeholders for all the stuff like introductions, transitions. I can't write conclusions to save my life. And so I just put stuff like, put a transition here, because I know I'm supposed to have one, or put a summary right here, or have a conclusion for this section here, because like that stuff's hard for me. And I don't need it yet. I need to get the content of the paper down so then I can feel better about myself and then I can go fix it. And by the way, often I really don't, I know what the paper is trying to do, but I know it's going to change before the paper is done. So if I'm putting all this time into my intro and the framing and all the nice transition stuff and the organization, that's all going to be wasted work most of the time because it's going to change. I often have totally separate files. I don't know why this works for me. This is just doesn't make any sense, but I write different parts of paper in totally different documents. Heather, do you do that? I do that. It's super helpful. I don't know why. Anyway.
I do though. I love your idea of not doing the intro and conclusion and transitions, because there are so many papers I've been going through like a final edit and I always skim those. And then I'm like, I actually read it and I'm like, oh, this doesn't make any sense anymore because I've totally restructured it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's a huge waste of work.
If you outline well enough, you could write an introduction, but you're gonna figure out something by writing the paper. And then you're gonna have to change that introduction anyway. I see this all the time when my honors thesis students, they're like, okay, how do I write an introduction for the paper? I'm like, wait, have you finished the paper? Then don't think about that ever. Stop thinking about it and come back to it later on. And because intros are hard and they get easy later on. I often will, as I'm writing about X, I'll be like, oh, here's a problem. Oh shit. Well, write down, here's a problem, Brian, and then don't worry about it. I don't jump around very well. Heather, this is, I think, some of what you were saying, is that I tend to be I get into a zone, I'm like, oh shit, I need to worry about that later on. If I worry about it now, I'm gonna like forget the thing I'm working on. I do a lot of that.
Yeah, I think the productivity research suggests it's super useful to put it somewhere so that your brain can say, I don't need to keep remembering it because I know how to deal with it. And then it gives you permission to focus on whatever you were trying to focus on.
I boldface. I started with 4 X's and then I write things to myself. I'm like, hey, Brian, blah, 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 blah. And then I stop boldfacing and then I go back to the writing.
Yeah, I do 3 question marks. So then I can easily find it with my Control F. Like, oh.
Yeah, no, that's why I do 3 X's, right? Or 4 X's.
Yeah, it's like a code that allows you to find it again.
I don't do a bunch of question marks, so I use that for something, anyway, whatever. And then also, I think I am so glad I do this. I create a new folder for every time I substantially edit a document. And then I put the backup, so every time I sit down to work on something I've written substantial amount of stuff on, I create a new folder, I copy, and you could do this on your Dropbox or whatever. And then I put the old version in there, and then I start working on the version. I know some people I've worked with start just a new file, and they have a new timestamp on the file. You could do that too, whatever. I find that would be overwhelming after a while. But you can see, like, here's my zillion. This is a paper I worked on for a long time. All my zillions of backup folders, and then I don't have to worry. Like, if I fuck something up, which, let's be honest, I'm going to a lot of time. I'm like, it's gonna be okay. I go get it out later on. And sometimes I'm like, like 4 drafts into a screw up. I'm like, Brian, why don't we just go back the way we did it before? It's such a relief to have it there. It doesn't always happen, but once in a while, I'm very happy it's there. And then I already said this, but I really don't worry about writing well early on. First of all, I'm not a very good writer. I'm never going to write very well. But I don't worry about writing to the best of my ability early on. It's easier for me to improve stuff that's there than it is to make it good the first time. A couple of exceptions, once in a while, there are things that you got to get right, because here's a definition, because I don't know if I don't know how to articulate this definition, I can't write this paper. Obviously, some of those things you need to work out. Edit, I edit a lot. I basically edit until I'm like, oh, this is pretty good, or I'm like, I don't know how to make this better. By the way, when I get to, oh, this is pretty good, I know I'm wrong, but I feel, but I don't know why. When I'm editing, I learned this from a friend of mine, which is the dumbest advice, but it's so helpful. I read when I'm at the stage. This is when the editing stage. This is like I've done the paper and I'm editing it, not the I'm writing stage. Every single sentence, I'm like, is that sentence true? And if it's not true, I change it. Heather, do you do that?
I was just thinking how useful that would be, because I tend to be a bit sloppy. I love like the big picture stuff. And so I'm always just like, yeah, whatever. People know what I mean. And then reviewers are always like, everything you've said is like technically false. Like, I think I see what you're getting at and it's interesting, but like it has to be fixed. And so, yeah, I'm now going to try this technique.
No, I'm also, it's funny because I'm very sloppy. And I know this about myself. And my friend of mine in grad school, Jeff Georgi, who worked for the Writing Center, he read a lot of my stuff. He was one of my sort of writing group people. And he's like, Brian, you are so, you are like just saying things that you do not believe constantly. He's like, I don't have to agree with you, but you should at least agree with you. And I'm like, oh yeah, it has been really good. But I only get to that stage after I've written the paper. And this is something I look for after I've written the paper. Reading out loud, super helpful. Probably everybody's already heard that a million times, but I love reading out loud at the sort of editing stage. I cut a lot at the editing stage. You get to a point you really need to stop and think, what is this paper trying to accomplish? Not what am I trying to accomplish in my life? You're not going to accomplish all of that in this paper. But what is this paper for? Why is that important? Alex, I see you're smiling because we all have this problem. And then I just cut everything that does not help me accomplish the thing this paper is trying to accomplish. It's hard, it's painful. When I cut it, I put it someplace else. I put it into a new file, I give it a nice title, and then I can go later on and write a paper about that if I really want to. Then I don't have to feel bad, right? But it's easier if you put it someplace, I find. And then then I send it out to somebody else. One quick thing about responding to feedback is I find often if I really need to change something a lot, it's often better to start fresh in a sense. I open I'm like, this section I need complete reworking. I find I just open a new document, totally blank. I just write that section out kind of from scratch. I outline it usually, then I write it out from blank. I find that is more effective in a lot of cases than trying to fix something that, if it's really broken, trying to fix the document I already have. I don't know why, but I find that very helpful. And you can definitely see that in papers sometimes, where a section's obviously gone through 20 million edits, and it's kind of like a Frankenstein monster, and it just reads, I don't know how to tell, but it just reads weird. Heather, do you see this sometimes in your own work?
Yeah, I really like the just start fresh. And so I think I do a little less of the note-taking stage. and more of the like, just write it as a paper. And then I'm like, yeah, trash, right? A new paper. Because I think often you realize that the thing you were trying to say is just different enough that you're like, oh, the structure was like all wrong. And so for me, just because I kind of like to the free, stream of consciousness as the paper, I think it's a little easier for me. So it's not as like handwritey.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, but it's the same, like sometimes it's better to just start again and get it right, and then it flows so much better. It's really hard, like you're saying though, sometimes you're just so like, this is such a cool point, but it doesn't help the paper. So like,
yeah, it'll help some other paper.
Yeah, maybe.
Or I mean, maybe
like,
not. That's right. Maybe not. But
yeah,
I have to say, like, I do have stuff that I'm working on now that like is the byproduct of stuff I was working on a few years ago that I just hit a wall on. I couldn't figure out how to make it into a paper. I'm like, ugh, I just don't know how to figure this problem out. I don't know what to do with it. It completely went nowhere. And then like a couple of years later on, like it cropped out. I'm like, oh, hey, that idea, I could use that. I didn't use the whole thing, but so it was nice. I'm glad I wrote it down. I'm glad I took okay notes back then. That I'm like, could kind of understand what I was doing back then. Yeah. All right, so that's all everything. I'm sorry, that probably went a little long, but.
Awesome. Thank you.
Heather, I think we're just gonna do Q&A at this point, right? This is what we discussed beforehand.
Thank you. That was super helpful. So yeah, we'll just open it up for Q&A now. I think we can just do like there's a small enough group. You can just jump in if you have questions. I guess I'll start. I was curious, Heather, if you could expand on the 80% of value comes from 20% of work. I'm curious about that because I guess, and it sort of relates to some of the stuff that I was thinking about when Brian was talking, because like sometimes I feel like I just like stare at a blank page or just sit at my desk for like 2 hours without actually like, and I'm like, was that productive? Like it could have been maybe if I was sort of brainstorming, but it also feels really unproductive because I didn't actually like put anything down. So I'm not sure how to feel about those sorts of moments, but I think maybe I should be like doing more of the brainstorming stuff. So I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah. So I think I always tie this back to the like big question. So one of my other like hacks is every time I open my computer, I have to say out loud the most important thing that I'm going to do when I'm on my computer, because it's like so full of distraction and I'm like, a goldfish like dog. I'm just like, what? So the 80-20 I feel is super important when you think about like, okay, I'm working on my dissertation. I'm working on this chapter. I'm working on this paper. What's the most important thing, right? And maybe it's like this new objection that you came up with that you want to see if it works, right? So then you do some notes on that, or maybe you handwrite them or whatever. Maybe it's like you're in your final edit stage. So the most important thing is to edit the whole thing. I think what can happen is often you like open the document, you kind of scroll up and down, and then like, maybe you see something and you're like, oh, didn't they just publish a paper? And then all of a sudden you're like kind of doing stuff that's not, it might end up helping a little bit, but it's not the most important thing. And so in order to like make the most progress for the time you have, you really need to focus on like, what is next, the next most important thing. And then just throw everything at that. Brian, did you want to?
That sounds right to me. Again, like so much of it is like knowing what you want to accomplish and why you want to accomplish it, and then trying to actually accomplish it as opposed to do something else. Heather, I don't know. This is a thing I see a lot, is that I think there's sometimes people just want to like say, I did enough. I spent enough hours working today. I can check that box, and like that's good. You need to like pat yourself on the back and say, I worked today. That's important. Like, but you should try to work on the right stuff, right?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first stage is just like having the time when you're going to be most productive, setting it aside, and then actually opening your computer and doing it. I think that's the first step, right? So it may be that if you're really bad at this, as I was like coming out of the summer, it's like COVID, I've got kids home all the time. It's just chaos, right? And I was like, well, maybe I just like won't do any work this fall. And I was like, no, that's bad. I should be doing work. So then I was like, okay, I got to like carve out the time. And once I did, you know, you open the computer, and if you're just starting, you're like you look at a bunch of old drafts, you're like, that's all trash. I don't even remember what I was thinking. I know I'm supposed to be writing on this literature, but I'm like more interested in this thing I've like only discovered yesterday. And so I think the first step is just to like be there, like experience that and say like, okay, this is like where I am. Because if you're making the commitment to the habit, then at first, even if it doesn't go super well, you can do that pat on the back and say like, yes, I am a writer. I am doing my routine. I am getting this done. And then I think what happens that's super underappreciated is it snowballs. So as soon as you get any kind of traction, like either in a new literature or on the paper you're writing, all of a sudden you're like, this is super interesting, and you want to read more and more. And so like in the beginning stages, for me, it's all reading, right? So like I find it really important to like make sure I'm up to speed on all the like recent papers in this thing. So I'll spend a lot of time reading. And once you're interested, well, that's just fun, you know, and you want to read the next one. And then once you start writing and you feel like you're making progress, all of a sudden writing for an hour and a half is kind of pleasant, and the time goes by in a way that it never does when you first start. So I think when you first start, it's fine to be like, I opened my computer, I spent like my 10 minutes looking at my blank Word document, and then I shut it. Because the next day you'll open it and like maybe write a few papers that you think you should read, and that's good. And then the next time, and you just build on those successes. And so, you're all going to be in different stages of like where you are in that process. But I think it's fine to start where like, I haven't written anything in months, and it's fine to be like, oh yeah, I'm just struggling with this current paper I'm on. Because yeah, half the battle really is like showing up. And then the other half is like doing the most important thing.
I want to just mention, I'm slightly different because I'm do a bit of writing before I read anything kind of person. And I know that's like very personal. So I just want to mention, like, I think that's not, the way you're doing it is one way to do it. And it definitely works for a lot of people. I don't think it's wrong to be like, I'm going to write a little bit first before I read. You can't get too much writing done before you read, because then you end up finding you reinvent the wheel. But I find that I can't, it's hard for me to engage with stuff that I read unless I kind of have a sense of why I'm reading it. And so kind of getting a sense for what I might think that I'm interested in or have to say, for me is really kind of having some thoughts is helpful before I just start doing reading. But
I think that's such a good point. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, please.
I was just gonna say that so you were talking about all the different ways of having ideas. And I think just to comment a bit on that in this context. So sometimes I'll be at a conference or I'll read a paper and I'll think, well, that's just a mistake, right? Surely somebody, and then I'll start reading around a little bit and everybody's making the same mistake. And I'm like, no, nobody should be saying this. And so then I feel like I'm super motivated with an idea. So the idea is kind of first. And then you go into the literature and then you just cherry pick the quotes of everyone saying the wrong thing. And you don't necessarily need to get super engaged. So anyway, this was my fission paper. Everyone was making kept repeating the same thing that I thought was wrong. So then this was the paper. But that's a really different reading than I have no idea. I know a lot about Humeanism. There's a recent debate about explanation and whether it's circular. I kind of feel like I'd have something to say about that. So now I need to just go to the literature and really start engaging with the papers, because I'm trying to contribute to this literature in a substantive way. And I think if you're just at a loss, you're I have no ideas. It can be really useful to pick a recent kind of self-contained debate and then just get up to speed and think what do I have to contribute? But it feels like a very different
really quickly,
kind of
self-contained is by crucial there, by the way.
Yeah, if you're I want to contribute to the hard problem of consciousness, what should I read? No.
I think also some of these things, I think it's important to know which of these are character traits you have to work towards and which of them are like things that you can start, right? So like, some of this is like, hey, you will get here eventually, and you want to know sort of where you're aiming so you can get there. And some of this is like, you can be here and you can be there now, right? And so I think, Heather, some of what you're talking about and what I'm talking about, like, it's not like you're going to be able to snap your fingers and like, now I'm doing this, right? But you need to know, like, for example, recognizing what is valuable or what is worth working on is a thing that you need to work on learning how to do, right? Probably none of you are like, well, I don't know. Probably some of you are good at it already and some of you aren't, right? But it's not a thing that you're born knowing how to do, right? And the same thing, recognizing what literatures are self-contained and not self-contained also probably, that takes a lot of practice. So knowing that this is a skill you need to cultivate. And I wanted to mention this in the publishing workshop and I forgot to. I had a really nice way of saying this after the publishing workshop and I totally forgot what it is. But you just need to start asking lots of people for advice. And some of them aren't going to give you advice. But that's okay. I mean, that's annoying, but if you don't ask so that's why you need to ask a lot of people. And especially the faculty, you need to start asking faculty for advice. And then sometimes you're going to ask them for advice and like, I can't give you advice because I don't know anything about X, or I can't give you advice because I'm busy, or whatever it is, right? And then some faculty just aren't going to be helpful, whatever. That's always how it is, right? And they're not going to be the place, whatever. There's definitely months in my life where I'm like, no one better ask me for advice right now because I'm not there, right? But just start asking a lot of people for advice, because part of how you learn, so like what's a self-contained literature, or what problems are worth working on, is by talking through this with other people who are more informed about some of those things.
I guess I have one quick question about that is, I feel like I've run into cases where I have like too much advice almost, or like I have kind of sort of overlapping but kind of conflicting advice from like various like corners. And then I have like panics of like, who do I listen to? And like, how do I sort of, I think maybe it's like, you have to kind of develop your own confidence in like what you really think. But I guess my question is, how do you do that? Which probably is a long process, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts about sort of, how to balance like competing advice and just like people having different opinions and different values, which is probably a good thing. But then how do you kind of like consolidate it to apply it to your own life?
That's awesome. I'm going to give you some advice. Brian hopefully will contradict me. So I was thinking with respect to like method. So like how should I write? How should I do this or that? Just treat yourself as the subject of the experiment and like try it. And you might be like, this is awful. I can't write in the mornings. I'm exhausted. Or try, something else. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is an amazing way to edit. Thank goodness I got this advice. And be generous with yourself. So if you try a new strategy for a week or two and it's trash, just be like, all right, I learned something, growth mindset. Great. That doesn't work for me. As far as advice about like content, I think it can be really tricky, right? So like the famous thing that has happened to me and to others is like you get feedback from the referees and one person is like, this is awful because the author says P, and the other says this is awful because the author says not P, or because, P is obviously true, P is obviously false. And you're like, okay, what do I do with this? And I think that's just hard. That's where you do need to like rely on yourself and you say, well, which do I think is right? And then how do I be super clear about exactly what it is I'm saying so that, you at least don't have this confusion of someone thinking you're obviously wrong for different reasons if you're not like wholeheartedly committing yourself to those, so sometimes people will disagree about why you're wrong because one has misunderstood what you're trying to do. And then that's easy, right? You just try and make it clearer what it is you're actually doing, even if they don't like it. And then, but I do think that can be really hard. One thing that we've kind of neglected so far is the feedback aspect. So I am like a genius. I come up with the most amazing ideas in isolation. And then I send them to someone and they're like, what about this objection? I'm like, oh, no, devastating. And so I don't know. I mean, for me, if I didn't get feedback, I would just produce like drivel. It would be awful. So it's so important to like get lots and lots and lots of feedback. And so then you do find yourself in that position of like conflicting feedback. Everybody has their own agenda too. And this will just get worse as you like go on. But someone will be like, you know what paper you should be writing? And you know what I think you should say. And so I think it's really important to develop that sense, that core sense of like, what am I doing? What's my project? And then that advice is contextualized in terms of like, does that actually further the thing I'm doing? Or is that just because I know that, you know, she hates like Bohemian mechanics. So of course she's gonna, you know, object in that way.
I think another interest, so yes, first of all, I agree, so I'm sorry. But I mean, Heather, part of what's really, I mean, we all, yes. I've gotten such great feedback from you, some really helpful feedback from you on my own papers, right? And this is, I think, a really fascinating thing. We are so much better generally, my experience, at giving people feedback on their papers than we are at giving ourselves feedback on our own papers. But I actually think that by reading a lot of other people's papers and giving them feedback, you do cultivate a better ability to give yourself feedback on your own work. You're still always going to need other people, but I think you do get a better sense for your own work by seeing what's working and not working for other people. And then also, yeah, put people's advice in context, super important, right? Also put and the same thing for referees, right? You're gonna be better as a philosopher if the more you think about where people are coming from, right? Everything everybody's saying and doing is in the context of all these background assumptions and theoretical maneuvers and things they think are important and stuff like that. And like thinking about what might be how that could be generating a differential advice. Really, sometimes the advice is only seemingly in conflict, or sometimes you can disregard some of it because it's not coming from the right place given what you want, all this kind of stuff. So developing your sense for where people are probably coming from is going to help you a lot with that, especially down the road when you're dealing with conflicting referees, because a lot of times it is, oh, right, you think it's obviously false because you're coming from this background, and you think it's obviously true because you're coming from this background, but I'm over here and I need to here's how I talk to both of you, right?
Yeah, it also helps you contextualize the paper itself. So yeah, part of the rejection I got today included the feedback that like, you're assuming like systematizing laws. What about people who like aren't? And I was like involved in this kind of like insider debate, right? And then someone was like an obvious kind of opponent to the person I was arguing against, but I was ignoring them, right? But I never made it clear that I was going to be ignoring them. And so that's one of the things that like in my rewrite will be really important, like setting up the project that I'm actually engaged in. So people aren't annoyed, like, what about this perfectly good alternative over here? Like, who cares about either of those?
Any other questions? I have other questions, but I feel like I've been the only one asking them, so I should allow for other people.
Let's do the good teaching thing. We're gonna point at everybody and say, do you have a question? This works like half the time. Jake, do you have a question?
No.
You sure? Emily, do you have a question?
Not at the moment.
Maybe only works with undergrads. Sorry, Emily, what?
I just said not at the moment.
Erica, you have any question?
Not now. Alex, your questions are great. I'm learning a lot from them. Thank you, guys.
Erica, are you in a recording booth?
No, well, sort of. Yeah, we're building one.
Lisa, questions?
Just one sort of production kind of thing that came up. I have heavy resistance to writing. So I try to sit and, you know, block out a time and write for an hour, hour and a half. And sometimes it's just, I'm just gonna make sure I write for a half hour because that's all that I can wrap my brain around. But I wonder if you have a process for like deciding what that most important thing is. I know that, I find that if I don't decide what I'm gonna write about the night before, then when I get to my desk, I'm like, I have no idea what I don't know. So I'm just wondering if you have like any advice for sort of pinning down the getting started point to sort of get past some of the resistance.
I love the idea. Oh, go ahead.
I don't, if we both unmuted simultaneously, Heather, go for it.
I was just going to say, I love the idea of deciding beforehand what it's going to be. And so it sounds like the night before is a good strategy for you. And so one of the things that you can like learn about yourself is, how do I work best? And if you know you work best when you have something in mind before you sit down, then you can like start a habit of every evening, you know, at like right before you get into bed, or, you know, after you've brushed your teeth, I don't know, you're supposed to have like a cue so that you never forget, something you do every single evening. And so when you do that thing, you say, as soon as I'm done with that, I will. And then your I will is spend set a 5-minute timer or something in order to write down what you think might be the most important thing for you to work on the next morning. So if you know that if that makes your writing better, then just leverage the heck out of it and see if you can build in that cue the night before, so that you wake up and you feel like, and I love those mornings when I wake up and I know what I want to do, because I'm like now so excited to like do it. You know, it's like the beauty of being in philosophy and doing research. Like, this is going to be awesome. And it may turn out the objection doesn't work and you'll like leave the day very frustrated. But I find that, that, you know, if you know that works for you, that's great. The way that I figure out what's the most important, like what's the most important thing, it's usually whatever I had to close my computer without doing, because mine all like, so at 8:30, that's when I do breakfast. So like breakfast is 8:30 to 9:30. I teach at 9:30, you know, it's like scheduled. So it's always like, not always, sometimes when I have to stop at 8:30, I'm like, really, I was like right in the middle of this. And so usually when I return, that's the thing that is most important. But if I do feel stuck, often what I do is I'll start rereading. And I'll go back through what I've written. And sometimes I'll be like, oh yeah, I was gonna like read that paper so that I could incorporate a quote that like says what I think that paper was doing. And then that'll be like, you know, kind of obvious thing to try. So sometimes rereading works for me. Brian?
So I mean, yeah, often my priorities are set by where I kind of run out of steam beforehand. I mean, I think you're totally right. You got to figure out, you got to try what works for other people, but you have to partly figure out who you are, right? So I cannot write in the mornings almost ever. So I know all these productive people say that, right? But it just didn't, I'm not, that's not Brian. So I don't, you know, that's not going to ever work for me. I've tried it. And you know, you can't feel too bad about it. For me, because I do so much outlining. And again, because like I have part of, I have experienced less of an aversion to writing because so much of my writing is in this like low stakes. I'm just going to write some words down with my pen on this. You know, we found these there's these like this, what's it called? Daiso. There's a Daiso store next to like this restaurant we like in LA. So when we go to visit my mom, we go to the Daiso store and they have these for like $1.50. And they're like actually really nice to write on. And I bought it, I like kind of slightly nice pens. So I have like a nice pen that I like to write with. And so I just for me, like, I'm not at the stage where I'm just kind of like noodling around philosophically. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm like trying to think something through and it doesn't hurt to get it out for me, like at that stage. And that's part of why I've worked on that, because I see a lot of my friends who struggled with writing. And I've read, you know, you read all about like writer's block and like the blank page and stuff like that. And so I try to kind of build my approach around not experiencing that so much. And like I'll start by writing what is X, or like why should anybody care about X, or what is the question I'm trying to answer. Like I will write that, you know, at the top of the page or whatever. And because I go through that process so much and I outline so much, here, I'll just really quickly screen share. Here is a very early stage paper for me. And let's see, like there's like, I put these, this is in random order, but like 4 of these documents are completely different outlines of the same paper. Because so one of them was just kind of like getting my ideas out after I'd already written it on paper. I was getting the ideas down into the computer, and then I tried to like write it. Let's see, is it this one? I don't know. So I don't remember which one is which. But one of them was my attempt to actually outline it. And as I'm outlining, I'm like, oh, wait a second, Brian. What about X, Y, and Z? And I wrote these long kind of just like notes to myself. Like, what if I said X? And oh, wouldn't someone say Y? And how could I convince them? Like all this stuff, right? And then I eventually worked it out in this kind of like vomiting on the page thing. And I went back and re-outlined it on a totally new document where it was much tighter. And then I went and started writing the thing. But once I started actually writing the paper, I kind of knew what I had to do. It was like kind of much more automatic at that stage because I knew where it was going. And I knew where it was going because I kind of scaffolded all these things that are much more manageable for me. I think this is partly, Heather, part of what you're getting at, right? In some of your productivity stuff, you got to take a thing that seems unmanageable and break it down into something that is manageable, right? So you set tasks for yourself. I can do X, right? I can sit down and write I can sit down and like just noodle a bunch of stuff through, and sometimes it'll be good and sometimes it won't, right? That's manageable for me, right? I can take all these things I vomited onto all these notebooks and then figure out what the argument is in there. Okay, that's manageable. I can outline that argument, but it doesn't have to be good yet. That's manageable. Okay, now I can take that stuff that I thought was a good outline that clearly isn't, and now I can kind of figure out how to actually make it work. Okay, that's manageable. Okay, now I have like this 5-point argument. Now I can start writing point 1. That's manageable. And it's not nothing good. Now I can start now I can go and take the stuff that I wrote for point 1 and make it actually coherent to another human being. Like that, each stage is much more manageable for me. And each stage kind of tells me what the next stage is going to be. But again, that's very personal, but does that help, Lisa?
That helps a lot. Both of you helped a lot. And I love the idea of thinking about it in terms of manageability rather than in terms of writing something good right off the bat.
Again, like if you figure out, Lisa, how to write something good right off the bat, you will be, just go into that field, do that, write that book and make $1 million, because like no one can do it, right? Or very few people can do it, right? We all struggle with this. And so it's again, finding out a way of making it tractable for us.
So yeah, fantastic. Just as another example of how you might organize this, I'm going to share, let me see if I can get my Chrome. Yeah, so this is my Trello. I use Trello as a way of organizing. And so you can see, so this is my anti-pragmatic Humean paper. So it's got a card. And what I do is I have all these checklists. And so read, these are all the papers that are like relevant. And so this is one that, as it happens, I, submitted. So they're all crossed off but I knew like at any given point, this is something I had to read. Sometimes they get deleted if it turns out I didn't need to read them. But then arguments, right? So like I remember I have to put in the actualist modalist argument. Humans are designed for laws. So these are super short, but they're reminders to me about when I need to do them. And so here's send draft 2, right? So these are all the people that I got, to give me some feedback on it before I submitted it. And then that card is just in my list of like papers. So any paper that I'm working on, I'll have notes for what I need to be doing. And I find that kind of helpful. And then that does provide at least a default list of like, okay, well, what's next? And some of those are way easier than others, right? One was like add line numbering. So there was because that was what the journal required. I had to have the paper have line numbers. So I was like, how do I do that in LaTeX? And so then, that was like going down a kind of like, not heavy intellectual labor rabbit hole of like LaTeX, so that was something I could do on a day. I wasn't feeling up for like deep, hard thinking. And so it's good having like a variety of tasks that need doing, because some of them are much easier than others. Daniel?
I really like, by the way, really quickly, you mentioned the procrastinate by doing easier stuff. Like, I'll get sick of my own research. I'll be like, I should be doing research today, but I'm sick of it. I'm just gonna referee a paper.
Yeah.
And that's like, I'm like, oh, it's like, I felt accomplished, but I also got to procrastinate. Some of my fastest referee reports were when I got the request and I'm like, oh, I'm so bored of everything else. I'm just gonna referee this paper right now.
Yeah, and if you're asking people for feedback, you saw that long list of people I emailed my paper to for feedback, like there's kind of a trade-off. So they then send me papers to read. So those are also, they take up research time because I don't have more time. And so there'll be days that it's easier to just read that. And sometimes when I'm feeling really lazy, I'll call up one of my good friends, Elizabeth Miller, and she and I'll just chat about philosophy, and that counts. That totally counts. And it's very pleasant. Daniel, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to?
Yeah, so I'm curious about the role of conferences in the writing process. If I send a draft to somebody I know and trust, I don't think they're going to steal my idea. But if I go to a conference, I'm worried somebody might take my idea. But also, I'm curious about, how do you pick a conference? How do you get into a conference if you're still narrowing down your ideas? Because I feel like a missing component of my writing process right now is getting help at conferences.
Well, I'll just begin by saying, I don't think you need to, I know we joined again. Don't worry about people stealing your ideas. That's just not something you should really worry about ever. It's happened, in philosophy. But typically what is most important is that you write all the time. So if you are consistently working on your stuff, you will just be developing so many ideas and you'll come up with so many papers. Most of them will never see the light of day because that's how it works. And the ones that get through will get through because you've been doing this kind of consistent work. If you go to a conference, this has happened to me, in a conversation, you feel like you're agreeing with somebody and you're like, yes, why has no one written this up? Then that might be an opportunity to co-author, and that I've done. And it was kind of fun because it was a paper that Mike Hicks is the co-author, and I don't think he would have written it up and I wouldn't have written it up. But together, it ended up being, I think, a nice paper in the end. And then Elizabeth Miller, my friend I described before, she and I had a long-standing debate about which one of us had come up with the idea. I thought it was hers and she thought it was mine. So we did end up co-authoring that as well for a collection. And so that's really the only time I've ever encountered this kind of whose idea is it really? And it's always been resolved in a very collegial way. So, you guys okay? And so I think I'll be right out, sweetheart. There can be this fear that you have one good idea and you don't want anyone to steal it, but really the right reaction to that is just keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. You're gonna have so many ideas, so many papers. If somebody beats you to it, writes it up before you do, they probably already had it to begin with. It doesn't even mean you won't be able to write your paper. Often the approaches are different enough that you can be like, well, look, you're doing it, but for the wrong reasons, or, you've got the right reasons, but you ended up at the wrong view. And so there's really plenty of room in philosophy for good ideas. So I'll just comment on that part of your question, and then I'll go rescue my little baby girl and let Brian comment on.
Yeah, I think worrying about getting ideas stolen, I mean, yeah, sure, it's not out of the realm of possibility, but it's rare. I mean, sometimes you'll get scooped. That happens. Someone will beat you to the punch. But it's actually going to conferences is better for that, because if you realize somebody already has your idea and is way ahead of you, that's useful because you can then maybe pivot a little bit or figure out how to make what you're saying more novel. So I think that's definitely a reason to go to conferences rather than not. How do you pick what conference to go to? I don't have good general advice for that. That's the thing. Seeking advice from a couple of faculty members is the right way to go, who work close enough to the area you're working in that they can give you good advice. I guess yeah, I don't have good general advice for that. I'm also not great about picking. I'm also not, don't ask me for, I'll give you advice, but I'm probably not great at it. I have not been terrific about picking conferences for myself. So, but yeah, going to conferences is really important for the networking stuff, for getting people hearing about your ideas. People are much more interested in your work if they hear about it. People are much more likely to listen to you than to read your paper. And then like, I think part of the question was, how do you submit ideas to conferences if they're not fully worked out? I have many thoughts about that. I can't distill them all into a quick answer because I haven't formulated them clearly. But in my seminar, I'm making them write conference abstracts as one of their tasks because, and I'm making them do it before they have a fully fleshed out idea because that's just how people do it now. So what people do is they think they've got an idea. If they can explain it well enough in 1,000 words, they'll send it to a conference because that's pretty typical for conferences. You send a 1,000-word abstract and you hope that it actually turns into a paper. And then once in a while it doesn't. If you're not at the stage where you can even explain well enough to do that, then you shouldn't be submitting to the conference yet. You need to get it more nailed down. Yeah, you should, if your idea is the point where you can explain it, you can spend half an hour talking about it and have come to some kind of conclusion. Yeah, then it's ready to write up for a conference. Yeah, there's a lot to be thought of. How many conferences you submit? Should you submit to grad conferences beyond a certain point? There's a lot of mechanics for sort of selection and how much effort to put into that. That's going to be very personal depending on what you're working on, where you're sending, what stage of grad school it is. So that's the thing where, go and get some kind of very hand-tailored advice. I would suggest for that. Probably actually some of you can probably actually, some of you I bet have presented as almost many conferences as I have. Pick a conference in a nice place so you can get paid to go there. And if you get a publication out of it, more the better. The formal epistemology workshop is occasionally in really nice places. So I've managed to have ideas about formal epistemology, and the last couple of times have been in a really nice place. It's been very convenient because I don't have a lot of formal epistemology ideas. So I'm like, oh, I'm going to make myself have an idea now. That was the one I said where I kind of squished together some stuff on epistemology and ethics, where I was like, oh, it's in Turin, Italy. I really badly want to go to Turin, Italy. That sounds really nice. There must be something, because formal epistemologists don't think about ethics very much. I'm like, there must be something of the intersection of ethics and epistemology that formal epistemologists haven't thought about already. I bet there's something to be said here. And I did have a good idea. Good for me.
Stop me if I'm repeating stuff you said, Brian, but one of the major benefits to me for conference travel is the ideas. So just being able to chat with people, and it's not always about your own. I mean, sometimes you go and you comment, sometimes you go and you observe, sometimes you do get to present your own work and get feedback, which is really useful. But also you'll have like 100 one-off conversations with people where, you find out what they're working on, you run random scattershot ideas past them, you have really fun discussions. You guys hopefully are having this anyway in grad school, but it always reminds me of my days in grad school when we were just talking about philosophy all the time. So I find that really useful, both like emotionally, it like kind of rejuvenates me. I'm like, oh yeah, philosophy is awesome. We got to solve all these problems. And also like professionally, you make these connections. It's good for networking. And also with the ideas, you make progress on ideas. It's so much faster if you're talking to someone that's not yourself, right? Like it's very hard for me to see my own mistakes, but it's very easy for other people to see it. So you have like this very useful exchange.
And you meet some cool people and you make some friends. Like that social, this is part of why like online conferences don't quite scratch the itch for me, because part of conferences can be super fun. You go and you hang out with some people and you don't talk about philosophy to some extent, and that can be super cool. And you get it. And I mean, on the sort of more professional stuff, you get a sense for what's interesting to people these days. That's also really nice about refereeing for conferences. Refereeing for conferences, you're like, oh, we got 30 submissions on X. I guess X is hot right now. I didn't know that, right? It's super helpful because philosophy has trends and stuff like that. And sometimes, if you can get in front of a trend, it's great. If you're on the back end of a trend, not so terrific, right? That can be super helpful.
Okay, I have one more question that I'll stick in before, because I think we're almost done. And I'm being blinded by the sun also. And this might be sort of more because I'm on fellowship this year. I have a lot of unstructured time, and sometimes I find myself kind of falling into this like, oh, it's 8 a.m. I'm going to start working, but like I have until 5 to work, and then like 3 hours later, and I've read a lot of Reddit comments and not done any work. And then I'm like, oh no, now I only have, like, and it just seems like a total waste of time. So I guess like, and I do feel like I sort of fell into this when I was in grad school before I was teaching, because I feel like when you're teaching, it kind of, you have really like, you're like, I only have 2 hours where I can do my research, so I have to do it now. But when you don't have that kind of structure, do you have any like tips on, I have tried the Pomodoro like thing, which has helped, because then I'm like, okay, I only have to work for like 20 minutes and then I can take a break or something like that. And I don't fall into that kind of, oh, I have so much time to work. But yeah, I'm curious if you have any tips on that. But it might just be because I am on fellowship during a pandemic, and so I have a lot of unstructured time.
Let me say one quick thing about that. Heather, I bet Heather has way more to say about this. If you have,
What are you saying, Brian?
Was that? No, because you've done the research.
No, I know. I just felt like she was speaking to me when that was me. That's
no,
me.
I know, but I want to say one thing. If you have in principle from 8 to 5 where you can work, you don't actually have to work every one of those hours, right? First of all, you are not. I mean, let's see, 8 to 5. How many hours is that? That's that 79 hours. Yeah.
No, it's
Jesus.
like it's too many.
You're not going to work for 9 hours on philosophy if you will.
But I guess I'm like, oh yeah, I have this free time. So like, and that's my job right now. Like I'm on fellowship, so I'm supposed to be working like all day, every day. So yeah, so don't think that. when I
was tutoring, this is advice from before I was a philosopher. When I was tutoring people to get into law school, everybody thinks I'm gonna spend 8 hours a day studying the LSAT, the law school admissions test. And I'm like, no, you're certainly not gonna spend 8 productive hours studying. You're most of it, if you spend 8 hours a day studying the LSAT, probably 4 of that's going to be complete waste of your time. Probably 6 of that's going to be complete waste of your time. So I think for me saying, if I get N good hours in today, that is what I can expect of myself, and that is feasible. And I'm not going to budget 4 times N or whatever it is, right? And for different people, N is a different number. I will say, when I was in grad school, we had a bunch of people who were crazy productive in our faculty. And I bumped into one of them on campus, and I was in my dissertation, writing my dissertation. And I said, I just feel like such a loser because I can only maybe write for 4 hours a day. And he's like, oh yeah, are you kidding? I don't write for more than 4 hours a day. No one I know, he rattled off all these people in our department who were like, big deals. It's like, they don't write philosophy more than 4 hours a day on average, right? Now, maybe he was lying to make me feel better, but it made me feel a lot better. Now, again, I don't know. I'm not saying you have to pick 4 as your end, but like, I was like, oh yeah, if I'm getting enough done in the long run, right? I don't need to tell myself I need to work all day, every day, because I'm not going to. I'm just going to feel bad about myself. So that's what I had to say. Sorry, Heather.
No, that's all excellent, and I'm very glad you said it. I was just laughing because that's just me. Like, I am 100% that way. If I have a certain amount of time, how long is it going to take me? That long. When is the most productive time? Right before the deadline. And so I think if you don't have a schedule that forces you, you need to just do it for yourself. And this is where a lot of the self-experimentation comes in. I think one of the things that can be really useful is thinking about, like, what are my like deepest values here? Like, what do I actually want my day to look like? And it's going to not be that you want to spend 8 hours doing philosophy, even if you could, which is ridiculous. I think closer to like 1 to 2 hours of like work, if it's actually focused deep work, is plenty. In fact, I think if you could actually do 1 to 2 deep focused hours a day on your work, you would very quickly outproduce almost anybody in grad school, because people just put it off and they do other things, and then they're trying to cram, and you can't cram paper writing, not in grad school, certainly not as an academic professional. So there's this like weird perpetuated myth, oh yeah, like only 4 hours a day, and like nobody I know does that. Nobody.
Yes, I didn't mean 4 hours every single day, by the way. If I did work 4 hours every single, that'd be mind blowing. I
Right.
meant sort of like, yeah, on the few days that I actually got to sit down and really spend serious work. Yeah.
And so Brian touched on this, but there's like tons of good research that suggests people are not productive for more than that. Maybe up to 4, like 6 if you're some kind of super being, but like 2 hours of like actual productive time. You're not answering email, you're not distracted, you're not like doing anything else. It's insane how quickly it builds and how quickly you make progress. So that to me was one of the biggest things, to like realize that, and also to see what like crappy work I did when it was all at once in a kind of panic before a deadline. So those were both like kind of emotionally motivating, but not necessarily motivating in the moment. So they kind of motivated me to learn all this like habit stuff. And so I'm really a big believer in habit. I think you need a habit of doing work, and you can't do it with willpower. You can't say like, I'm going to try even harder this time to not get on Reddit, because your brain's like, no, Reddit has been engineered to like take advantage of all of these things that in our brain that are like not how we want them to be. So you need to figure out how to create that structure. And what I was getting at when I was talking about these deep values, it may turn out that you're like, wouldn't it be great if I was going for like a walk for an hour every day, right? Or like, taking the time to make myself a nice lunch, right? These can all be things that once you're committing to them, they help provide some of this additional structure in the absence of teaching. So I think it's just so important, and the faster you learn this skill and the more you can like rely on it, of course, the better. There was something else I wanted to mention. It was about filling time. See, and now it's gone because that's my brain. Yeah, anyway, I'll pause there.
Awesome, thanks. That's so helpful. I feel like I just like put all this pressure to do like the 9 to 5 kind of thing, like, because I worked 9 to 5 jobs prior, and that's kind of, I don't know, my parents have a very strict view of like what counts as work and stuff like that. So I'm always like, I have to be like at 9, and then I have to like keep going as long as I can. But then when I do that, those days are much less productive than other days where I'm sort of, doing it when I'm at my best. So that's super helpful advice.
Alex, you do not need to worry. There are going to be, at some point, people are going to expect you to work lots of hours, and very little of it's going to be your research. If you have this nice window where you're allowed to not work all the hours in the day, you do not need to feel guilty. You will be exploited unjustly for the rest of your life.
Also,
don't feel guilty about this.
If you take a more holistic approach, you're like, what makes me the best writer I can be? Good nutrition, a good night's sleep, some exercise, and also the time, the like free time for my brain to be like working on the ideas when I'm not writing. And so, like give yourself work credit, in the sense of like an hour spent walking on the trails or something while I'm thinking about whatever, means that that argument that I was working on this morning is going to be, your brain is very helpful in that respect. It's so good at like crunching things while you're not paying attention. And so you leverage that by every day doing a little bit, because then every day you have more for it to chew on. If you wait and try and do it all on a Friday, you're doing yourself a big disservice. So really just, it's the consistent practice, and start small. And then what you'll find, I think, is that it builds in this momentum. And don't beat yourself up if it's not, this is one of the habit techniques, is you commit to like sitting, opening the computer, saying what you need to do, and then like sitting there for 10 minutes. And maybe that's it, right? Because that's very easy to do every single day. And then if you do more, great. If you do less, or you can't do less, but if you only do that, then you've still done your habit, and you still get that like reward of like, yes, I did it. And then that'll build. And then pretty soon you'll be really impressed with how much you're doing.
I was talking to Chris Heathwood about this, and he was saying, that he'd been reading about this stuff, and because he also, I think, struggles with many of these issues. And he's like, he just set out to do some very, very minimal amount of work every day. And he's like, oh yeah, actually, once I kind of start, I almost always do more.
Yeah.
You know,
Totally.
Heather, what's the research say about, so when I had a research leave the first semester of the pandemic, so I also had a lot of unfocused time. And so I gave myself a lot of structure, but sometimes I'm just like, I woke up, I'm like, I can tell it's not going to happen today.
Yeah.
It does. What does the research say about cutting yourself some slack here and there?
Yeah, so it's really mixed. Some people say it's important to build in like some buffer. And so if you like having like kind of cheat days, it can be helpful to have like a bowl of stones, and like every half hour you do research, you put one in, and then every day you take one out. And so the goal is to never have your bowl be empty. So if you overdo it one day and underdo it another, you're fine. This works really well for me in exercise because of my like physical problems. Sometimes exercise is not in the cards. Other days it feels great. And so it makes me feel like, good, I'm still kind of like keeping up with my general goal. Other people, like the habit literature, tend to say you need to make it small enough that even if you're like ill, you're vomiting, you know, you've whatever, you can still do it. And so like for running, it's that you have to put on your tennis shoes and like go outside and shut the door. And like if you're really, really ill, you can still do that. And then you come back inside and you say, I did it. And so the idea is not to have any exceptions. So this is kind of like Parfit's, you know, streak. You want to like have all the gold stars, not a single day goes by. If you feel like that's too high stakes or stressful, some of these other techniques might work better. And so I think one of the initial resistances to the habit stuff is like, well, how is like just putting on my shoes ever going to help me run? And it just turns out that like it does, you know, it's kind of like a surprising thing we've learned about human psychology, that just opening your document, like sitting there for 10 minutes, you start to get bored. You're like, I guess I'll like see what I was thinking. And then pretty soon you're writing. So.
My mom taught middle school, and she taught, she had particularly students who needed a lot of help. And she said she would get these students, she'd get a kid in the class who was just not wanting to do the work or whatever. And she said, you know, a lot of time what you do is just sort of like, as long as they're not being super disruptive, you just ignore them and you teach a good lesson, and they get bored and then they get interested in what everybody else is doing. And then they want to open their book and like, you know, go along with everybody else. It is really apparently that was a really effective technique for like kids who were sort of would have been really disruptive otherwise. And so, yeah, I guess human psychology is weird, right? If you're like, well, I guess I am working, who knew it? But I do think it is probably very personal, because I do have cheat days here and there, and those have been okay for me. But I can definitely see other things like some of my eating habits or whatever, where I'm like, oh no, I can see if I give myself a cheat day, it would never stop at that point.
I think also in this literature, only because like I read so many of these books, it's ridiculous. There's like this practice of being like, this is the method, you know, and like you follow my method that usually has their name attached, you know, and they have a bunch of like principles, you know, the like ABCs of product, you know, and you got to like do their acronym. But of course, you know, the advice is probably general, and it's probably that you don't need to follow it to the letter. You can just kind of pick and choose and say, this is useful from this, that's useful from that. And then you build your own kind of uniquely tailored, you know, I don't know, Alex Lloyd system. But I should probably get going.
Yeah, I was gonna say thank you so much. This has been like incredibly helpful. There's like so much good advice in here, so I hope other people do take a look at it and stuff, because I feel like, yeah, building the habits. Yeah, because I feel that way with with running as well, where I'm like, if I put on my shoes, like have to go outside, and then if I do a mile, and then I always end up doing more. But if I don't put the shoes on, then it's not going to happen. So absolutely, it's been super helpful. So thank you so much. We'll give like a little.
Yeah. And if you guys have any other questions, or any of the people watching the video later, feel free to send us emails or ask at other times. Happy to chat about this. Like I said, it's my kind of side hobby, popular psychology. So
How's
Yeah,
it
if anybody needs advice, but definitely Heather knows the productivity literature better. But if it's something about not about that, I'm happy to chat about what little I know about that too. So
Yeah, and then I just really quickly stuck like a daily news thing in the chat that I found helpful. It's just like a list that people compiled of like different ways to structure your paper. And when I'm sort of struggling with how to frame an idea, or like I'm like, what am I doing in this paper? It's helpful just to like go through the options, and they'll be like, oh yeah, like I can frame it as a puzzle or something like that, you know. So I just thought that was helpful, so I thought I would stick it there. But anyway, thank you so much. And yeah, we've gone over time, so we should go.
All right.